Welcome to Tech This Out. I'm Walt Macaborsky, and we have a very special guest today, Arati Prabhakar. Thank you so much for joining us. She is the Director of Science and Technology for the White House. She advises on tech policy and is an advisor to the president. She's also the former head of DARPA. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's so great to be back in Austin. Thank you, Walt.
Do you know much about the Austin ecosystem? You know, Austin is on the move. What is your take on Austin's tech?
Well, listen, first of all, I grew up in West Texas in Lubbock, so have watched Austin and the whole state over many, many decades. I had family that was here in Austin, and my background's semiconductors, so that's the piece I've really seen. And of course, Austin's been such a huge player in semiconductors now for decades. And now with President Biden's Chips and Science Act, actually, that was the last time I was in Austin, was to help announce the big partnership that we've got with Samsung, where they're building out in Taylor, Texas. So I've seen so much happening that's changing Austin and changing this community, but actually contributing to the country's goals in such a powerful way. So it's always great to be back here for all the activities that are going on.
Yeah, it's a very exciting time, and you've had an incredible trajectory in your career. And I wanted to ask you, with your access and what you see, is there anything that really excites you about the future of technology or scares you?
Yes. Well, that's a perfect question because I see that we're at a moment where the technologies that we've created are so powerful, so fast moving, so broad. Artificial intelligence is the perfect example of that. It's fueled by the semiconductors and the information revolution that's brought us to this point. And I think the way you just asked the question is perfect, Walt, because every way that we are using technology today has a bright side and a dark side. And really our job, all of our jobs, very much the way we think about it from the White House, but really the job for the country is how do we get this right? How do we make sure that we use semiconductors and computing and networking and artificial intelligence and social media in ways that bring us together, help us achieve the hard things that we're trying to do as a country, and protect people in the process. And that's our day-to-day work in the work that I'm involved in.
You know, you said AI is the most consequential technologies of our time. What do you see as the most promising application for AI for the United States, maybe in the next decade?
Well, I think if you look today, artificial intelligence, companies are working on using AI for every conceivable purpose. A lot of the applications are how do you sell services to businesses to help business be more productive, or consumer services. And as long as that's done responsibly, we really want to see that happen. I think it can be very good for productivity and really enhance our economy. What I think a lot about is how do we harness AI for public purposes, because we need it for the country's work. So think about where we are in terms of our ability to design new drugs. We literally have thousands and thousands of diseases that we know about for which we have zero drugs. And right now we create about 20 or 30 or 40 new drugs a year. So we're not going to get there at the pace that we're going. AI can completely transform not only the way we design drugs, but how we approve them. And so that's something that we in the private sector need to be doing together. That's a great example. It's going to change how we forecast the weather. And in a period of changing climate, that becomes even more important. We already are seeing how it's changing the way our kids learn. And if we can harness the power of AI to really bring personalized learning to each one of our kids, we can start to close these gaps in education that really are devastating for our kids and for the next generation. So I think the potential is huge. That's why both President Biden and Vice President Harris made it such a priority to get AI on the right track so that we can manage its risks. We have to do that to be able to seize all of these opportunities.
And that's a big challenge. How does America balance the responsible development of AI and the need to keep up with countries like China that don't have the same guardrails?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you put your finger on it. Look, we're at a time where every country in the world is racing to use AI to build a future that reflects their values. And we disagree about a lot of things in this country. The one thing I think we're all very clear about is that none of us wants to live in a future that's determined by technologies that are driven by authoritarian regimes. And so that means two things for us here in the United States. One is making sure that we put the protections in place so that AI is not making biased decisions when you apply for a mortgage or a loan or for a job, that we're not violating privacy, that we're not undercutting jobs and employment, that we're not creating dangerous new capabilities with AI, number one. And then number two, let's use it to go to the stars. Let's use it to really do some of these big things that can move all of us forward.
You know, California recently passed a significant law regulating AI, or trying to. Texas held hearings on AI recently. Are there concerns about creating a patchwork of AI regulations across different states? Do you hope to see a United States of America with one regulation that we can all unleash the power of AI, but also work in the same framework?
Well, I think that's got to happen at some point. And you know, a lot of what's happening today with AI, with legislation and regulation, it comes from a place of concern that we didn't really get it right for social media, for the social media era. And of course, we want all the benefits of connectivity and communication that social media brings us, but I think none of us wants to see the mental health effects on our kids, the disinformation that's so much part of that environment. So I think we've already seen, and we call it social media. Of course, it was AI and algorithms that were driving a lot of that. And now what we're seeing is a surge in AI technology that's bringing it into so many more parts of our lives. So I do think that there is a lot of appropriate concern that we didn't really fully deal with the issue in the social media era, and now the technology is racing forward. So yes, I think, you know, if you look at where we are, it is somewhat patchwork, and I think that is deleterious. It's not helpful for us as individuals. It's not that helpful for the industry as well. So I think there's a chance to start getting this on the right track. Again, the work that we've been doing in the White House, really it started a year and a half ago when we talked with the president and talked with the vice president about what was happening in this AI moment. And they said, look, we've got to get this on the right track. They mobilized to get voluntary commitments from AI companies about how they would move forward. They put out a significant executive order that said, look, this is the landscape. Here are the measures that we're going to take under existing law. And then we've continued to work with Congress. We've worked with the international community, including the United Nations. And I think, you know, these are the early steps, but ultimately we do need to get from patchwork to something that works smoothly, not just around the United States, but around the world.
One more thing on AI. As we head into the election, are you having to advise the administration on deep fakes? This is fraud. I think two people from a Russian television station were just arrested or indicted because of trying to infiltrate election misinformation. How big of an issue is AI going into this election? I mean, the technology is so good, and the deep fakes
Yeah.
are fooling journalists and people who think they know.
Yeah. Well, look, we had a problem with poor information quality even before this huge surge in generative AI that makes it so easy to generate convincing images and voice clones and fake videos. So I think it's very much on everyone's minds. You can see action in Congress where a number of bills have been introduced to try to deal with some of these issues. So, some very practical things are already happening. You might remember that there was a voice clone of President Biden during the New Hampshire primary that was making calls and urging people not to vote in a particular moment in that primary. It turns out that that's not okay to do, is committing fraud. Even if you're using AI, it's not okay to commit that kind of election fraud to try to persuade people against voting. And the Federal Trade Commission went after the company that put those voice clone phone calls out, and they've had to pay a fine. So, you know, look, the system works, and for a lot of the harms we're worried about with AI, things like fraud and bias in employment or in housing or in loans, those things are already illegal. The question is, how do we make sure we enforce as it becomes easier and easier for people to use AI in these harmful ways?
Um, Moving on to just the explosion in ecosystem and tech, you know, as the head of DARPA, DARPA just set up shop in Austin with Capital Factory to work with a team here to look at the innovations that are happening in Austin. An robotics company, Aptronic, was in the system and came out of DARPA. They have a robot named Apollo that's working with Mercedes now and doing some incredible stuff. How important are companies like DARPA and the governmental and the private partnerships in forging a new way forward with innovation?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great question. Let me step back and talk a little bit about the big picture that's going on here. So DARPA was created in 1958, right on the heels of Sputnik. Think about that, you know, with the height of the Cold War, humans put a satellite on orbit for the first time ever, but the humans happen to be the Soviets. How, this is the end of the world, and so we scrambled here in the U.S. Actually, a lot of good things came out of that period, and one of them was starting DARPA. Well, so in that period, of course, there were nation states controlled some of the most key technologies, satellites, of course, but many other highly advanced technologies. What's happened in the intervening decades is that those public investments in science and technology, in semiconductors, in computing and computer science, those led to a phenomenal, just this explosion of capabilities. It's the information age that we live in today. So today, if you look at where innovation happens, where R&D dollars are spent, so much of it is in our private sector, so much of it is in these information intensive industries. That's where AI advances come from as well. And so now we are at a moment where, from a national security perspective, everyone around the world gets to play with all of these technologies. We used to own all the marbles. That's not the world that we live in anymore. And so it really, when I was at DARPA, which is now about a decade ago when I was leading that organization, we were already in a time in which national security was critically dependent on deep links and using commercial technology, and our edge from a national security and military capabilities perspective, our edge is more and more going to come not because we have just some particular secret sauce, but it's going to be how we put those components of technology together more rapidly, how we use them with the most amazing warfighting talent you could possibly imagine. The American military is just the people who compose our military are just the most skilled and dedicated people you could possibly imagine. So it's going to be those elements that give us the edge that we need to maintain national and then global security. But it means a very deep partnership with what's happening commercially, and that's why you see these links to what's happening here in Austin.
And defense tech is really surging here. BAE, they have this great technology called D2, and they're really a leader, a global leader in that sector. How exciting is it for you to see the advancements happening so quickly now? It would be years before. Now it's happening so fast.
I think the pace is something that's really quite different. That's true militarily. It's also true in our personal lives, and I think it's exciting. It gives me great hope because I can see the progress in a lot of areas, and it also means I think I talk to so many people who really feel that technology is coming at them and it's something that they have to deal with, and it's changing rapidly and it's being done to them. And I think I want to make sure we get back to where people feel that they are in control and that they're able to use it to do the things that matter to them. So I think again, it's always bright and dark, so it's great, but I think it's a challenge for all of us to keep up with.
It really is. I just wanted to touch on a few more things. Nanotechnology. It's hard for me to wrap my head around it, but the advancements and the levels that we're seeing now, why is that going to make a difference in medicine, chip making, everything on that kind of spectrum?
Those are two perfect examples for nanotechnology. Nanotechnology was a field that arose out of an understanding that, on the one hand, we have high energy physics that understands what's happening with subatomic particles, and on the other hand, we know how to deal with larger, with chunks of material, with a chunk of silicon or a piece of steel. But we actually didn't have a great understanding of what's happening at this nanoscale, this sort of molecular scale, up to building very small devices like a semiconductor device, and that was a burgeoning area, and that the physics of what happens in between the very, very, very small and then the macro scale, that something very different and interesting was happening, and it was a place where we could create materials and devices and all kinds of new capabilities, and that's exactly what happened. So if you look today at the way we deliver vaccines today, often they involve lipid nanoparticles. These are little tiny encapsulations of the vaccine that make it very easy to deliver into your body and help those vaccines be effective. That's just one of the many ways that we're using nanotechnology in medicine. And of course, when you're building advanced semiconductors today, we're building these huge wafers, but on them are billions or even trillions of individual transistors. And now a transistor is so small that its critical element might only be a few atoms wide. So again, you have to be able to understand the physics of what's happening at that scale. It's really mind-boggling, isn't
It
it?
really is, and exciting at the same time. And before you leave, I wanted to ask you about quantum computing. Is America leading the charge in quantum computing, and how big of a game changer will that be?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. It's a fertile new area. It's not an extension of regular computing. It's a kind of computing that's very good for one or two things that we've identified. One of them is breaking encryption codes, so that's a huge thing. And that's obviously of great interest if you're in the business of breaking encryption codes. But that's something we know it will be good for, but there's still work ahead to make sure that we can get there. Quantum technology, if you look not just at computing, but the ability of using individual atomic particles and controlling them and using them to sense changes, that's a much broader field and one that I think has all kinds of interesting applications. So I just saw a demonstration a few months ago of cold atoms that are atoms that are suspended, and then lasers are shot at them in a way that take all the energy out of that individual atom, and the temperature of the atom is actually colder than anything you'll find out in the universe. It's that cold of an atom. Beautiful physics in doing that. But once you have this very isolated cold atom, it becomes a very, very, very sensitive detector of gravitational changes. And so it's actually being used to detect lava flows in a volcano before a volcano erupts. So it's amazing to think about the command of physics that we've got and the practical ways that we can use it now.
It's a wild frontier for sure. As you look at Texas and as you visit Austin today, I really feel like not only Austin, but Texas is on the move. We have companies like Plug and Play fostering the ecosystem. You have Capital Factory making sure there are connections with VCs, along with other startups in town, trying to not only support the ecosystem, founders, startups, and get the money here, but it really feels like Texas is now becoming a leader in the world when it comes to technology. What do you think?
I think this is a very exciting time for Texas, and what you're describing really reflects something that's happening across our country. And I want to just reflect for a minute about how you all got here, because I think it's a great, great story. Because it takes so many different smart decisions happening together. I think about your universities, of course, the University of Texas. When I was out here for the Samsung announcement a few months ago, we went from Taylor, Texas over to Austin Community College, where they're educating these kids on these incredibly complex pieces of machinery that'll help them, be the effective technicians that make things happen up in that Samsung plant. So having education and the way for people in the community to find a path into these great jobs, you have to have that. You have to have enlightened policies at the state and local level, and then coupled with the federal investments over many decades, investments in research and development in our universities and our smaller companies. And then, of course, now things like chips and science to make sure we get leading edge manufacturing back in the US. And then, of course, the entrepreneurs, the investors, all those private sector actors that when all those conditions are there, then you can really go. And it's really fun to see all those pieces coming together right here in Austin.
And finally, the University of Texas wanted to know what tech they can use in the football to win more games.
I
They're
just
on their
want to
way.
say I went to Texas Tech, so
Guns up. All right.
I think it's probably a conflict of interest for me to advise UT.
Anything I didn't ask you or you think is important to say um, about what's happening in America with tech or your visit to Austin?
Well, I'll just say that every time I've talked with President Biden or Vice President Harris, these are two leaders who they come to work every day to help build a future for this country that's better than our past. And when we talk about technology, getting it right and then using it to build the future, that's what we get to do every single day at the White House. And it's a great privilege to be here to see it happening in Austin.
Arati Prabhakar, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for joining Tech This Out. Remember, you can check this out every Friday night on CBS Austin News.